Someone might ask, why the Vulgate? We have many other texts from the classical era, from the medieval era, and from the Renaissance era, and later in Latin that might be just as worthy of reading, or in the eyes of some, even more worthy of reading. And I certainly don't want to discourage anyone from exploring Latin texts from any and every era. But in keeping with the purpose of the Daily Dose of Greek and the Daily Dose of Hebrew, we wanted to focus on the Latin scriptures. As I mentioned in the introduction video, there's all kinds of good reasons to study the Vulgate, because it was, until relatively recently, chronologically speaking, the Bible in the Western Church. Knowledge of the Vulgate can connect you in a unique way to the Bible that so many millions of Christians over the intervening ages have known as the revelation of the Word of God and used in daily liturgies, in their prayers. These are the texts that were memorized century after century, and that played such a huge role in all kinds of sacred writings, sermons, theological treatises. They show up, the texts of the Vulgate show up in all kinds of poetry, in elusive ways. It's all over the place, really, from the end of late antiquity until, as I said, just a few centuries ago. So there's all kinds of reasons to study the Vulgate. There's other great things to study. But if you're interested specifically in the Latin scriptures or in experiencing the scriptures in Latin, as many Christians in earlier centuries did, then this is a great use of your time, I think. And I'm looking forward to exploring it with you. Another question our subscribers might have is, why this particular Vulgate? When I say this Vulgate, I'm referring to the Editio Quinta of the Biblia Sacra Vulgata, edited by Weber and Grayson and published by the Deutsche Bibelgesellschaft. Why this Vulgate? Well, there are a few reasons. One is this particular Vulgate is an attempt to reconstruct the earliest texts of the Vulgate. That is, to get about as close as we can to the work of Jerome and the other translators who contributed to this, what was in antiquity an enormous project. Another reason why we use this edition is because it's relatively easy to find and quite accessible, and was recently brought up to date with some important changes in 2007. So it's a relatively recently updated work of scholarship. And it's easy to find. You can find it on Amazon for a not exorbitant price. There are other editions of the Vulgate, scholarly editions, that in some respects might be preferable for the use of scholars. But for the use of the general reader, this is the easiest, the handiest. You can carry it around in your school bag with you or your backpack throughout your day. And we think it's a great choice. Now, the textual history of the Vulgate is extremely complicated. We can't delve into it too much in our videos because we would use up all of our time, probably, just talking about that. Some people have their favorite editions. There are some people who swear by the Clementine Vulgate, and they have their reasons. But we think it's going to be easiest and most straightforward simply to use this edition, which is a good, recent, scholarly one. A question we get quite frequently at the Daily Dose of Latin is, why do you use the classical pronunciation instead of the ecclesiastical one? It's a good question. I think ultimately it's not of great significance, and I'll explain why. But let me start simply by saying I use the classical pronunciation not in some attempt to reconstruct the way Jerome might have sounded when he read from his own translations or any of the other translators in this great project. By the end of the 4th century and into the beginning of the 5th AD, Latin was already undergoing some changes in pronunciation from the classical period. It would not have sounded, the Latin that Jerome spoke, exactly like what we know as ecclesiastical pronunciation either. The whole question is more complicated. In any case, I'm not trying historically to reconstruct some original pronunciation. Basically, there are only two main competing systems of pronunciation among modern students of Latin, the classical and the ecclesiastical. And we simply need to choose one of them. It's a fairly arbitrary choice for those historical reasons, but I can explain in a little bit more detail why I've opted with the classical one instead of the ecclesiastical. So there's a number of reasons why I think the classical pronunciation is preferable for a project like what we're trying to do at Daily Dose of Latin. The first and most important reason is most beginning students of Latin learn the classical pronunciation. The ecclesiastical pronunciation is still learned in many places, in many institutions within the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, in many seminaries, both Catholic and Protestant. So it's not that the ecclesiastical pronunciation is not also common. Both are common, but most students learning Latin for the first time using one of the more popular textbooks, they learn the classical pronunciation. So I want to speak in a way that's intelligible to those people and that helps to reinforce the pronunciation that one would use if one were learning some of the basic central texts of Roman civilization, which students of Latin, of course, often do. So Virgil, Cicero, Horace, etc. Another reason is that the classical pronunciation is what I myself use in my classes when I teach Latin. It's also the Latin that I speak. I'm an active user of Latin. I have friends who speak Latin fluently using either the ecclesiastical pronunciation or the classical pronunciation. And I have friends who can switch back and forth between them at will pretty convincingly, depending on who they're talking to. So in fact, some of my closest friends who speak Latin use the ecclesiastical pronunciation. They don't have any trouble understanding me. I don't have any trouble understanding them. It's not really something that we argue about. It's really not worth arguing about. As I said earlier, neither is really a good historical reconstruction of how the Vulgate would have sounded among its original audiences. So the point is kind of moot. Both are sort of equally inappropriate to what we're doing. But because most students who learn Latin learn the classical pronunciation, I think it's preferable. I might add, I think that the classical pronunciation is a little bit easier for beginning students. Some of the sounds in the typical ecclesiastical pronunciation take a little bit more practice to do convincingly. The classical pronunciation is sort of what you see is what you get. So that's another reason I think it makes sense. All in all, as I said, I don't think it's an issue really worth getting too bent out of shape about. None of us really sound very convincingly like authentic Romans. None of us, when we speak or read Latin, sound exactly like Jerome sounded when he spoke Latin. So we're not trying to reconstruct the past precisely. We're simply trying to approximate a reasonable version of what Latin sounded like at many points through its history. I hope that helps answer the question for some of you.